Hello again, I'm Dave Apsley. I'm a forester and a natural resources specialist with Ohio State University Extension. Today I'm in Jackson County, Ohio at the historic Buckeye Furnace, and I'd like to introduce you to Bitternut hickory. Bitternut hickory is a relatively common hickory, but it grows in sites that you typically don't find the other hickories. It typically grows on north and east facing slopes or down near the toe of the slope where you find more mesic species like American beech, or here we've got a lot of yellow buckeye and even walnut. So bitternut hickory, like all the other hickories, have pinnately compound leaves that alternate sides of the twig. Bitternut hickory typically has 7 to 11 leaflets, which distinguishes it from many of the other hickories. The only other hickory that commonly has 9s is shellbark hickory, and shellbark hickory can have anywhere from 5 to 9. This one will have 7 to 11. So if you're commonly finding 9s or 11s, then it's probably bitternut hickory. This time of year, it's hard to find those leaflets. So if you look on the ground, you can often find these things called rachises. The rachis is the little stalk that the leaflets appear on. And if you pick up a rachis and rub your fingers along the edges, you can feel bumps where those leaflets were attached. 2, 4, 6, and then 3 at the tip makes 9. So even though this was a relatively small rachis, you can pick it up and tell that it had 9 leaflets. These leaflets are a little bit more lance-shaped. They tend to be a little bit thinner. They're not as broad, and they tend to have a little curve, especially on those terminal 3 leaflets. Another characteristic that makes this tree really unique are the buds. Once you get past about midsummer, you're going to start seeing these valvate buds. By valvate, it basically means that the few bud scales that it does have don't overlap like scales or shingles. They more touch each other and are adjacent to each other. What's unique about these valvate buds are the fact that they are bright yellow in color. Again, once we get past about midsummer, you're going to see this sulfur yellow color. Color kind of reminds me of the color of a school bus. So it's very easy to identify this if you find these buds. Some people refer to them as naked buds, but in general they tend to have 4 scales that all just touch each other and don't overlap. The other thing that you want to look for is the hickory nuts. Like all the other hickory nuts, these have splits or sutures. They'll split about halfway to the base, and then they'll have these raised ridges. I had a really hard time finding many of these hickory nuts this year. These are actually from last year, but even with last year's nuts, you can see the raised ridges. This is actually a hickory that's very closely related to pecan, and pecans will also have these raised ridges on the splits of the hickory nuts. None of the other common hickories here in Ohio have those raised ridges. The other great identifier is the husk thickness. Thickness of this husk is typically around about 1/8 of an inch. So it's probably the thinnest of all the hickories. Pignut hickory also has a thin husk, which is very close to the same thickness. So again, thin husk with the raised ridges and splits that occur about halfway to the base are great indicators for bitternut hickory. Bitternut hickory gets its name because these hickory nuts are not sweet like shellbark or shagbark hickory nuts, and they're really not good for human consumption. Many of the wildlife species don't prefer them either, but they will be consumed by rodents like squirrels later in the growing season. And then finally, if we look at this bark, it's not typical to what we think of hickory bark at all. It's actually a very tight bark, and on smaller stems, it's very tight and smooth and gray. As it gets older, it stays tight, but you'll start picking up these interlacing ridges. The ridges are much narrower than, say, mockernut hickory, and in the woods, it has this light gray appearance. Bitternut hickory can become a very large tree. As I mentioned earlier, it grows on these very moist sites, so there's plenty of moisture and lots of good soil typically at these lower slope positions to allow it to become a very large tree. Thank you so much for your time, and please take at least part of your day to enjoy it in the woods.